It was a cold morning in the small coastal town of San Roque. The mist covered the beach like a grey veil, and the sound of the waves crashing against the rocks filled the air with an almost hypnotic monotony. An elderly man, dressed in a tattered coat and worn boots, was walking with his dog along the shore. The dog, restless, tugged at the leash, sniffing something in the wet sand. At first, the man thought it was a pile of seaweed or perhaps some debris washed up by the tide. But as he got closer, his breathing became heavier. There, lying face down, was the body of a man. The pale skin of the corpse contrasted with the dark suit he wore. He was barefoot, and the wind gently moved the tangled hair that covered part of his face. There seemed to be no signs of violence at first glance, but something about the scene was deeply unsettling. It was then that the man noticed the watch on the corpse's wrist, an old model with a worn leather strap and a cracked glass. The hands were stopped at an exact point, 3:15. The elderly man took a couple of steps back, trembling. He tried to scream, but his voice got stuck in his throat. The dog barked insistently, breaking the heavy silence of the morning. From atop the promenade, a couple of curious fishermen peeked out at the commotion. Within minutes, the local police arrived at the scene. The officers surrounded the body, taking notes and photographs, while trying to keep the curious onlookers at bay. There was no identification, no phone, no clues as to who the man was or how he had ended up there. Only the broken watch, a disturbing detail that seemed more like a message than a coincidence. That was the beginning. No one in San Roque knew at the time that the body wouldn't be the only one. The town's tranquility was about to be shattered, and with it, the buried secrets that many thought had been forgotten forever. Commissioner Hernan Campos, a robust man with graying hair and a face weathered by years of service, arrived at the scene shortly after receiving the call. Violent crimes were rare in San Roque. In a town where everyone knew each other, a corpse on the beach was enough to disrupt the routine of any morning. "What do we have?" he asked as he approached the young officer who was already placing yellow tape around the scene. Male, about 40 or 50 years old, no ID. Looks like the tide brought him in, but there are no signs of drowning. The watch on his wrist. Well, it's odd. The hands are stopped at 3:15 and it's broken, the officer explained, pointing to the object. Campos examined the body closely. The traces of wet sand around the corpse looked as if someone had deliberately placed it there. The watch immediately caught his attention. It was an outdated model, the kind of item someone would keep for sentimental reasons rather than practicality. Squatting down, he inspected the victim's wrist. The leather strap seemed to have been adjusted recently, leaving a mark on the skin. "This wasn't an accident," he muttered to himself. The wind blew harder, lifting particles of sand that embedded themselves into the officer's boots. Campos stood up, his gaze fixed on the horizon, where the ocean stretched out endlessly, cold and dark. There was something about this scene that deeply unsettled him. A few streets away, Laura Montero, the newly assigned detective who had joined the small town just 2 weeks ago, was finishing her coffee in the tiny police office when the radio crackled to life. "Laura, head to the beach. We've got a body. Campos wants you on the scene," the operator said, sounding slightly nervous. Laura placed the cup on her desk and grabbed her coat. She hadn't had much work since arriving in San Roque. In fact, accepting the transfer to this quiet town had been an impulsive decision, a way to escape the ghosts that haunted her back in the city. But now, as she made her way to the beach, she felt a tingle in her stomach that she couldn't decide was excitement or dread. When she arrived, the commissioner greeted her with a brief nod. She surveyed the scene in silence, analyzing every detail. There was something peculiar about the body, a disturbing sense of calm in the way it lay there, as if everything had been meticulously planned. "It's yours," Campos said, crossing his arms. "I want you to take charge of this. Request whatever you need." Laura nodded but didn't take her eyes off the corpse. She crouched to get a closer look at the watch, her gloved fingers carefully brushing against the cracked glass. Something about the object sent a shiver down her spine. 3:15. "Does anyone know what it means?" she asked, breaking the silence. The commissioner shook his head. "No, but I have a feeling this won't be the last message." Laura straightened up and looked toward the town. The red-roofed houses sat still beneath the mist, as if the entire place was holding its breath. Something told her this case wouldn't be as simple as they thought. And she was right. The San Roque morgue was small, a functional but limited space. Dr. Julian Ortega, a forensic doctor with more than 2 decades of experience in the town, was examining the body under the cold white light of the operating room. Laura and Campos watched from a corner, both silent as Ortega quietly took notes. Caucasian male, between 40 and 45 years old, medium build, no signs of struggle or visible wounds, except for some superficial scratches on the hands. He probably dragged himself across the sand or tried to hold on to something before falling, Ortega said, pointing to the marks. Laura frowned. Cause of death? Ortega raised an eyebrow and stepped back to remove his gloves. That's the interesting part. There's no sign of drowning or internal trauma. The lungs are clean, the heart is intact. But I found something peculiar. He turned toward the table where he had placed a small metal tray. On it were traces of white foam, somewhat dried, that appeared to have come out of the victim's mouth. This is pulmonary edema. Normally we'd see this in cases of severe poisoning or heart attacks, but there's nothing else here to explain it. Campos crossed his arms, clearly frustrated. Are you saying someone poisoned him? Ortega shook his head. I can't confirm that without toxicology tests, but I found one more detail. With a gesture, he pointed to the inside of the victim's mouth. Laura stepped closer, putting on a mask before leaning in. On the upper palate was a small circular burn, as if something hot had been pressed there. What the hell is that? Laura muttered as she stepped back. Ortega nodded gravely. It looks like a mark made with precision, maybe a metallic instrument. This isn't something that would happen by accident. Laura and Campos exchanged a glance. The case was not only getting strange, but also starting to take on macabre undertones. What do we know about the watch? Laura asked, changing the subject but keeping the tense tone. Campos sighed. It's an old model, probably from the 1960s. We've handed it over to a specialist to analyze it. But for now, there's nothing linking it to anyone from around here. Laura nodded slowly, her eyes once again falling on the corpse. Something about that mark, the stopped watch, the way the body was left on the beach. Everything seemed carefully designed. That same night, Laura sat at her desk in the precinct. The town's lights flickered in the distance, and the sound of the wind battered the windows. She spread out the photographs taken at the crime scene and began jotting down notes in her notebook. Male body found on the beach. No identification or belongings. Circular mark on the pallet. Watch stopped at 3:15. She stared at that last note. Why 3:15? A message, yes, but what did it mean? Before she could delve deeper into her thoughts, her phone vibrated. It was Campos. Laura, the watch specialist, just called. He says he found something. You need to come right now. Laura grabbed her coat, feeling a chill that had nothing to do with San Roque's cold weather. Something told her that what they were about to uncover wouldn't bring reassuring answers. Laura reached the station in less than 10 minutes. The streets of San Roque were deserted, with only the echo of her footsteps reverberating against the walls of the low houses. When she entered the small meeting room, she found Campos standing next to a thin man with thick glasses and disheveled grey hair. On the table, the broken watch lay next to a notebook. Laura, this is Ignacio Diaz, a specialist in antique watches. We brought him in from the city to analyze the watch, Campos said, gesturing toward the man. Ignacio nodded with a slight, nervous smile. Pleasure to meet you, Detective Montero. What did you find? Laura asked directly as she sat down in front of the watch. Ignacio adjusted his glasses and carefully pointed at the object. This watch is quite rare. Very few were made in the 1960s, and most were part of limited editions. What's curious is that this particular one seems to have been modified. Laura frowned. Modified how? Well, normally these watches function with a mechanical system, but someone replaced some of the internal components. I'm not exactly sure why, but I'd say they tried to integrate something that doesn't belong in the original design. Ignacio picked up a magnifying glass and pointed to the back of the watch. The strangest part is this. Laura and Campos leaned in to see. On the inner side of the back cover, some initials were engraved. M.H. Any idea who that might be? Campos asked, crossing his arms. Ignacio shook his head. Nothing yet, but that's not all. The stop time, 3:15. It's no accident. The mechanism was tampered with to stop exactly at that time. Laura felt a chill run down her spine. Why would someone do that? Ignacio looked up from his notes. That's what you need to figure out. But whoever did this knew exactly what they were doing. This wasn't improvised. Laura leaned back in her chair, processing the information. The initials, the altered watch, the mark on the victim's palate. It all seemed part of a meticulous plan, but they still couldn't decipher the message. Campos cleared his throat, breaking the silence. All right, here's the plan. Laura, start looking into whether those initials match anyone in the civil registry or from around town. Ignacio, thank you for your time. If you find anything else about the watch, let us know immediately. Ignacio gathered his belongings and left the room, leaving Laura and Campos with the watch still sitting on the table. There's something else, Campos, Laura said, staring at the photographs of the body on the beach. That mark on the palate, it looks like a symbol or a signature. What if this isn't the first case? Campos looked at her with a mix of exhaustion and concern. I hope that's not true, but you're right. Let's talk to Ortega. Have him check if there are any records of deaths with similar details. Laura nodded and gathered her things. However, just as she stood to leave, her phone vibrated again. It was an unknown number. She hesitated for a moment before answering. Detective Montero, said a deep, steady male voice on the other end. Who's calling? There was a brief silence, as if the caller were deciding what to say. Finally, the voice responded. 3:15 isn't the time on the clock. It's the moment when everything ends. Before Laura could reply, the call ended. She stood there, frozen. As cold sweat began to trickle down her back, Campos turned, noticing the expression on her face. What happened? Laura slowly set the phone down on the table. I think the killer just called me. Laura wasted no time. As soon as she finished telling Campos about the call, she began drafting a preliminary report on the incident. The voice of the man on the phone still echoed in her head. It's the moment when everything ends. Something about the way he had said it, slow and controlled, made her feel a physical discomfort, as if the phrase was more than a threat. It was a warning. While Laura immersed herself in the system records, Campos returned with a coffee and a tired expression. Ortega reviewed some similar cases. There are a couple of unsolved deaths in nearby towns that might match this. Bodies found in public places, no clear signs of violence, but with strange details. One of them has something that might interest you. Laura looked up. What detail? Campos sat down in front of her and slid a file over. 2 years ago, in Valdegrande, they found a man dead on a park bench. The security cameras didn't capture anyone near him in the hours before, but the coroner found a mark identical to the one on the palate of the man from the beach. Laura grabbed the file and quickly opened it. The case photos were eerily similar, the man sitting as if asleep and the burn on the palate. And no one connected this to a pattern? She asked, incredulously. Campos shook his head. It was filed as an isolated case. At the time, there was nothing else. But now, with this second body, the connection seems clear. Laura looked at the initials engraved on the beachman's watch. M.H. If this case was related to the Valdegrande one, there were two options. Either those initials belonged to the beach victim, or they were linked to the killer. "Do we have any names in the Valdegrande records that match those initials?" she asked. Campos shook his head again. "I checked. Nothing matches. But there's more. Ortega mentioned that both bodies had traces of a chemical compound in their blood. It's not common. He said it could be a sedative, but he needs more time to analyze it." Laura nodded, jotting down a note in her notebook. "A sedative? That would explain why there was no struggle. He drugged them before, whatever he did to them." Laura's phone vibrated again, interrupting the silence. This time, it was a text message. When she opened it, she felt the blood freeze in her veins. "Stop looking, or the next victim will be you." The message came from an unknown number. Laura showed it to Campos, who cursed under his breath. "This is no longer just a meticulous killer. He's playing with us," he said, furious. Laura snapped the phone shut. "You know what I think? This guy wants us to keep looking. If not, he wouldn't have called me or sent this. He wants us to find him. But on his terms." "And what are his terms?" Campos asked. "We still don't know, but I bet anything you want that the initials and that damn burn on the pallet are the keys." Campos nodded, though his expression remained one of concern. "I'll reinforce the security at the station and have them watch your house. We can't take any risks." Laura didn't respond. Her mind was elsewhere. The phrase from the call, the text message, the watch, the burn on the pallet. Everything was connected, but she still couldn't put the pieces of the puzzle together. That night, while reviewing the files in her apartment, she received an anonymous email. It only had one attachment, a photograph of an old church with the words San Miguel written on the facade. Laura stared at the screen, trying to remember. That church had been abandoned for years, located on the outskirts of town next to the forest. A sense of unease washed over her. Was it a clue or a trap? Laura parked the car a few meters from the main entrance of the San Miguel church. The building, made of aged stone and covered in moss, loomed like a spectre amidst the twilight of the forest. The only illumination came from her flashlight and the faint glow of the moon filtering through the bare branches of the trees. The air was thick with humidity, and everything was in complete silence, except for the occasional crunch of leaves under her feet. Laura adjusted her coat, more out of instinct than due to the cold, and walked toward the main door. The church had been abandoned for over a decade after the congregation stopped attending due to rumors of strange activity. Stories of nocturnal rituals and figures moving in the shadows had fueled local legends, but Laura had never paid them much attention. Until now. The main door was closed, but not locked. With a push, the heavy wood creaked open, revealing an interior shrouded in darkness. Laura turned on the flashlight and swept the beam of light across the walls covered in graffiti and the floor littered with debris. The main nave was empty, but the echo of her steps made her feel as though she wasn't alone. At the center of the altar, something caught her attention. A small, dark figure stood out against the stone platform. Laura moved cautiously, her heart pounding. When she reached the altar, she saw that it was a metal cross deliberately placed. At the feet of the cross, there was a clock identical to the one found on the beach. Laura bent down to examine it. It also showed 3:15. Her mind started racing. This wasn't a coincidence. The killer had wanted her to find this, but why? Suddenly, a noise behind her made her turn sharply. The beam of her flashlight illuminated a dark figure that quickly vanished behind one of the columns. "Stop! Police!" she shouted, drawing her weapon. Silence returned, but Laura knew she wasn't alone. With the flashlight in one hand and the gun in the other, she moved toward where she had seen the figure. Her breathing was heavy, and each step seemed to echo on the stone floor. When she rounded the column, there was no one there, but on the wall someone had painted something recent, with red paint still fresh. 3:15 will be your hour. Laura swallowed hard, trying to stay calm. She slowly backed toward the exit, staying alert. Every shadow seemed to shift, and the echo of her footsteps now felt like a distant murmur. When she exited the church, the cold air outside hit her like a slap. She turned to look at the facade, feeling as if someone was watching her from within, but there was no one. Back in the car, Laura sat behind the wheel, trying to calm herself. She started the engine, but before driving off, she checked the clock she'd found on the altar, on its back, instead of the initials MH. Swing this time, there was just one word engraved, chosen. A knot formed in Laura's stomach. This case was no longer just about the victims. Now she was part of the game. The feeling of being watched grew stronger, and Laura couldn't shake the paranoia left by the church. That night, as she reviewed the images and details of the investigations at her home, the word chosen echoed in her mind. The connection between the victims and the killer was taking shape, but every clue she gathered seemed to push her closer to a dark fate. The next morning, Laura met with Campos at the precinct to discuss what had happened at the church. She showed him the photo of the clock and the message on the wall. He looked at her worried, but there was also a hint of determination in his gaze. This is no longer just about a killer, Laura. This is someone enjoying the control. Every one of these steps is designed to lead us forward, and you've been marked as the next victim. You've seen it. Laura nodded, not taking her eyes off the photo of the clock. The idea of being so close to the truth terrified her, but even more terrifying was the possibility of being just another piece in someone's game, someone who had already proven their power. They decided to investigate more about the church and its former inhabitants. The property had belonged to a religious group in the 90s, but had disappeared after a series of reports about dark rituals and abuses. However, the records didn't contain much more. Everything was vaguely documented, as if someone had tried to erase the traces. That's when Laura remembered something crucial. In one of the previous cases, one of the victims had been a member of that cult, someone whose name had been lost in the news. The missing piece finally clicked into place. The killer wasn't just choosing his victims, he was also sowing chaos within the very structure that had formed him. But the question still remained, who was he? How did he manage to stay one step ahead? Soon after, Laura received a call. The coroner's report on the sedative found in the victims had been conclusive. The compound was rare, used in small batches within certain esoteric circles. The connection to the abandoned church was undeniable. The final clue, however, didn't come from the forensics or the files. It came in the form of a direct message, another email, this time with an attachment. Laura opened it and instantly recognized the place. It was the Church of San Miguel, but this time it wasn't empty. In the image, she could see a hooded figure with its back to her, standing next to the altar, facing the cross. And below, a text. "We'll meet soon, chosen one." Laura felt her skin crawl. The figure in the photo wasn't a stranger. It was him. The man from the previous victims, the one who had been the shadow at every step. There was no more time. Laura knew what she had to do. Steeling herself, she headed back to the church. She knew there was no turning back. If she wanted to solve it, she had to face the killer once and for all. But when she arrived, something made her stop. The door was open. Inside, the dimness enveloped her immediately. She walked cautiously, every sound, every shadow, making her jump. She moved toward the altar where she saw something that made her stop dead in her tracks. On the floor, under the cross, was a new mark, a figure painted in blood. In the center, the same initials, MH. The killer had been waiting. She was the last piece of the puzzle. The hooded figure suddenly appeared behind her. Laura turned, aiming her weapon, but he didn't react. In a cold voice, almost a whisper, he said, "Welcome. I knew you would come." The face of the killer wasn't that of a stranger. It was someone she knew. A man who had been part of the investigation from the beginning, someone who had been watching everything from the shadows. A member of the forensic team, someone who had been closer to the truth than she could ever have imagined. "The chosen one," he said, smiling. "It's time for it all to end." But before she could do anything, a loud crash broke the silence. The ceiling of the church creaked, and fire erupted from the nearby candles. The hooded figure fell to the ground, and a cloud of dust filled the place. Laura quickly got up, her heart pounding, but there was no more movement. Soon after, Campos and the rest of the team arrived. They found the killer's body, but Laura knew she hadn't been the one to stop him. Something had happened inside that church, something she could never fully understand. And as the lights in the precinct went out that night, Laura looked at the victim's clock, still intact in her hand. The 3:15 was still marked on the glass. "Not everything is over," she whispered to herself, but this time the killer was no longer there to play.